Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video of myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is another kind of outside of the Ukraine war breaking news update concerning the Australian election that has just taken place. It's been a pretty staggering victory for the Australian Labor Party against all the odds if you were looking at the polls back in February and prior to that. This has been a victory for Anthony Albanese, the incumbent leader of the Labour Party, leader of the country, taking a consecutive victory for the first time for the Labour Party since goodness knows when, since Bob Hawke, and one of the biggest victories since, is it Chifley or someone way back when. So this is a really big victory, and it's looking like they're going to get a majority government, and that wasn't what was expected. I mean, it was thought that Albanese would win, given the polling changeover since February, but actually the level of success of the Labour Party has been really, really interesting. Let's go and see. So just to let you know, you got the Australian Labour Party up really against the Liberal National Coalition. So the Liberal National Coalition is basically your Conservative Party. In the US, that would be your Republicans. The Labour Party being your Democrats, broadly speaking. Trade unions are an important thing in Australian politics, and they're a bit of a dividing line. Here is an analysis of the board probably about half an hour ago, and it shows you the extent of the victory and how much the Labour Party have not just held on to all of their seats, but have eaten very successfully into the Liberal National Coalition, and even taken Peter Dutton, who was hoping to be Prime Minister himself. His seat has been lost. So this is a bit of an analysis of where we're at the moment, or where the Australians are at.
You know, you take one look at the big board and you can see the scale of what's happened tonight. Let's just fill in what's gone on here. Since we last checked in with the big board, a number more seats have been filled in with colour. So we've seen the safest seats on either end and the most marginal in between. Now, this first column here for Labor was one of the most critical parts of this equation. They needed to hang on to these seats to keep that red wall up, to keep any coalition incursion from making its way onto this side of the board, and they've successfully done that. We've got Labor colouring in almost the entirety of its side of the board, and also making waves on coalition territory. They've claimed all these marginals on the coalition side, going all the way up to Leichhardt and then down to Braddon. Braddon has seen a swing of about 15%, so they've made deep inroads into coalition territory. Another notable thing here to see is the number of independents that have been returned to the crossbench. We've got Fowler, Dai Lee retaining there, Curtin, Kooyong, McKellar, Goldstein, Wentworth, Indi, yet again, Warringah, Mayo, Clark. And then we've got Bradfield over here with Nicolette Buller taking that seat off the retiring Paul Fletcher. So let's add in now the seats where we are not in a position to project just yet, but we can see who is ahead. Now you'll note from that last count there weren't any Greens on the board, but here's where they are ahead: in Ryan, in metropolitan Brisbane, in Richmond, and that's pretty much it. Also notable here that there is no blue on this side of the board. There is no blue on this side of the board. The onus was on the coalition to gain an extra 19 seats. They've lost 14. Let's take a look at Tasmania as an example of what's happened in that state. There is no blue on the board for Tasmania. The Liberals have been wiped out of the state of Tasmania. I want to check in with Casey Briggs now on what the swing has been looking like in that state and elsewhere in the country. Casey, what does this tell you?
I mean, look at this.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. You get the idea that there's a big swing, and actually the Greens have not done very well, by the way. Now, just to explain how the voting system works in Australia, you have a preferential voting system. Okay, so it's a system that requires voters to rank their preferred candidates from first all the way through to the last on that ballot papers. Okay, and then what happens for the preferential voting is that While the idea is same for both the House of Representatives and the Senate, they work in slightly different ways. House of Representatives involves lots of contests where there's only one winner for each electorate. By contrast, the Senate is one big contest in each state and territory where there will be multiple winners, 6 for each state and 2 for each territory. The House of Representatives method is pretty simple, while the Senate method is a bit more complicated. I'm just going to explain the House of Representatives method here. So for a candidate to be a winner for their electorate, they have to win 50% of the vote. But because there are usually more than 2 candidates in the race, once all the ballot papers are counted and tallied up based on how they ranked first, it's likely that no one has more than 50%, right? Here's the difference between the UK, Canada, the US. That's first past the post. So it doesn't matter if you've got like 10 people vying for that seat. As long as you get the most votes, that's all that matters. So you can have many electorates in the UK where only 35% of the people voted for the person that ends up winning, because the rest of the 65% is split between other parties and they don't get more than the 35% of whatever party is that got the highest. So you can win with only 35% of the vote, and that can mean that 65% of the constituency do not want you in. It could be that all the rest of the 65 hate the person that gets in. So actually, most of the people hate the person that ends up winning the election, because it's not about getting to 50%, it's just getting the most votes in one voting round. But here, what happens is, so the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is knocked out. So if you don't get to 50%, so it's all right. If someone gets to 50%, they just win, right? But it's unlikely that you get to 50% with just the one round of votes, although it does happen. And if you don't get to 50%, the person who gets the lowest number of votes then has their second preference added in to, so they get knocked out and their second preference goes to whoever it goes to. So the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes is knocked out, and the votes of everyone who ranked that person as number one are redistributed. Here's an example of how that looks from the Australian Electoral Commission, which is the body that runs the federal elections here. Those votes then go, it gives you a link to how to look at an example. Those votes then go to whichever candidates each of those voters put as their second preference. Depending on the number of candidates still in the race, this might mean a candidate ends up with 50% of the vote and a winner is declared. But there's still no one with the 50% of the vote. The process continues. So the candidate with the next lowest number of votes is also knocked out, and the votes of everyone who put them first, as well as any redistributed votes ranking the candidate second, are redistributed. If 2 candidates end up with the same amount of votes after this process, which is the case in the example that was given, the AE says the candidate who had the lowest number of votes in the first count is knocked out. It keeps going until the candidate has more than 50% of the vote. Okay, so that's how that works. What you have had actually is, and there was an interesting statement on this in one of the posts here from the Guardian Live blog, and a brutal night for the National Liberal Coalition. Here, pollster Kos Samara says Labour successfully captured more young Australian voters than millennials and Gen Z, though not in first preferences, right? So the young voters have generally gone, I don't like these establishment parties, right? And so you end up voting for someone else. But then when the second preferences are taken into consideration, so some of these fringe parties that these younger voters voted for didn't get through, then no one gets over 50%. But their second votes are more likely to have gone to Labour than to the Liberal National Coalition. While many voters in those generations strayed away from the major parties, he says they still preferred Labour over the coalition. If you look at the 6 million voters plus voters out there, the majority of them belong to these generations. They are not happy with a duopoly, but when they will preference the Labour Party. The narrative that the coalition has built in their heads around this mythical voter out there that votes for minor parties, that is right-wing, that loves the culture wars and gets into all this stuff, is false. Right, the culture wars is an important point to talk about here. So we're going to go to an analyst before going to a really interesting article on the effect that Trump has had on this election.
Cos, I want to look at this stunning result.
That's
for Labor.
Cos
What does it tell us
that was
about
just
the primary vote
quoted
for the
there.
Labor Party to have done this well?
Well, it's clearly gone up, and they're capturing a growing number of Australians who we've been talking about now for some time. That is younger Australians under the age of 44, millennials and Gen Z. But the other point I'd like to make is that over 6 million Australians have voted for something.
That's where the quote
like
comes
major
from.
Parties today, and over the course of the last 2 weeks, and the majority of them preferenced the Labor Party. So this narrative again that the coalition has built in their heads around this mythical voter out there that votes for minor parties, that is right wing, that loves the culture wars, that gets into all this stuff, is completely false. Because again, if you look at the 6 million plus voters out there, the majority of them again belong to these generations. They clearly are not happy with the duopoly, but when they will preference the Labor Party because, should be no surprise to anyone, at the beginning of the campaign, the coalition started by promising to hurt 40,000 Australians by sacking them, then promising to hurt a whole bunch of working mums by forcing them back to work, back to the office. And it was basically a suite of policies that it was all about pain and no hope.
Which was Doge-Style policies. It's really interesting that Nigel Farage, in his speech at Durham County Council in the UK, where reform had just done well, he's just said, if you are a DEI hire, we're out for your job type thing, and we're going to get you back to work. There's no working from home. Nigel Farage has taken the Trump message, the Doge message, and they're trying to apply it to UK politics. Let's see how that works going forward, because actually in Australia that was seen as not popular.
So of course this is the result they're going to get.
How much can the Labor campaign take credit for what's happened here, and how much are external factors, things like Donald Trump and the economy and inflation kind of bouncing back?
I think both. You know, a victory of this size, many things contribute to it. Your opponent needs to be completely hopeless and culturally blind, and they are that. Secondly, you need to run a really bloody good campaign, and they did. Paul Erickson ran an absolute professional campaign, one of the best I've seen in terms of.
So the idea is that Labour did a really good campaign, and Durrant was just not very good, and just fluffed it, and was too pro-Trump, and then it was too late to turn it around when they tried to distance themselves from Trump, when it was clear that wasn't picking them up much popularity.
Discipline and coordination. There wasn't a foot put in the wrong place. And then, of course, external factors like the Trump factor did help. So they all mix into the same pot and produce this sort of result, which is historic.
PK, I want to talk about this crossbench here. This was one of...
So we're just going to go, before we go, and it was a really good acceptance speech by Anthony Albanese, actually. And he talked about unity and humility and a whole bunch of different things. I just want to go back to an analyst here who I thought summed it up pretty well. I'm going to see if I get the right place. So here it is. This is one of the Labour politicians on the panel here who I think is on to win his seat, unsurprisingly. And he reflects a little bit on the language of Anthony Albanese, the winner of the election tonight, effectively, and his vision of Australia, but also the kind of rhetoric, the unifying rhetoric that he had. And as I say, his speech was really, really very good. I listened to it all. It was an excellent speech to accept victory. It was really positive. It was do you know what? As I was listening to it, and you know my views on Donald Trump, it was in stark contrast to a kind of Donald Trump speech that is all about him and all about how wonderful he is. And Albanese's speech was all about Australia and unity and being grateful, but being humble, and all of these things that were really there was a lot of cheering because it was a very positive speech, and like, I'm not Australian, but I got a bit emotional getting carried away with a positive vision of Australia, and just being someone who is very empathetic with the audience, with the electorate, and understanding, serving for all, but acting as one, as a country. And the politician here really sums it up well.
And we won't waste it.
Just one more question about the language of the speech. He returned to the theme of kindness, which is a line that came out in one of the debates. I can't remember whether it was your one. Kindness is not a weakness.
Yeah.
So how important has that been to the nature of the campaign and the presentation?
Well, I think every once in a while there becomes a moment in campaigns or in government or politics more broadly where you sort of stop for a moment and you think, when did it become weakness to be kind or generous or inclusive or gracious? And again, I come back to the way that Anthony leads our team. He's not, he doesn't hoard power for its own sake, he shares it. And that makes it a very enjoyable government to work in. It's why we respect him so much. It's why we're proud of him tonight, is because he genuinely leads a team. And I'll be grateful to him for the rest of my life for letting me work with Katie Gallagher, who's an unbelievable colleague, the finance minister. And we all feel a sense of that gratitude. And so the way he leads his team is the same way he leads the country. He leads with strength, but he listens with humility. And I think you saw that reflected in the speech.
Jim Chalmers, your seat of rank, and I've just checked that when you mentioned it.
And I think that was really well put. The results seem pretty clear. 71 seats to Labour, 76 to Win, 23 for the coalition. I mean, it really is a bit of a hammering. As you can see, Greens really taking a beating because they don't seem to have done so well out of the voting system. So they don't look to be getting as much representation there, although this system is much more preferred, in my opinion, to the British first past the post system. But yeah, so I think a really resounding victory for the Labour Party. Now, I just want to go through some of this because there's been a lot of talk about how this was an election that was lost by Trump, in the same way that Mark Carney won in Canada as a result of Trump getting involved there. And indeed, you could argue elsewhere around the world, the effect of Elon Musk on the AfD in Germany wasn't actually forthcoming, although they did quite well, but it was seen as just aligning with their polling anyway. Here, Trump effect, says The Guardian, has left Dutton exposed and Albanese in pole position in this atypical election race. And this was before the election, but really revealing here. So the Trump effect has cruelled Peter Dutton's campaign. Nothing else, no other single factor can explain such a dramatic collapse in support in just a few short weeks. And having run so many red lights on the journey to election day, is only himself to blame. You can go all the way back to the voice debate when, in August 2023, Dutton went on 2GB and attacked the Australian Electoral Commission over the ticks and crosses issue. The AEC is one of Australia's finest pillars and provides us with a democratic system demonstrably superior to that of the United States. He said of the AEC's voting method, which has been in place for 35 years without any serious objections, that, quote, you can't have a situation where you provide favour to one side in a democratic election. It's completely outrageous. It just stinks, to be honest. The tactic, casting doubt on the legitimacy of an election ahead of time, so unfairly and in retrospect so unnecessary, both tactically and politically, had a sniff of Trump's stolen election claims about it. Had more in the media pulled him over and given him the ticket he deserved at the time, then maybe some of the future red lights would have been avoided. But much closer to the election, he was still driving recklessly. When Trump came up with an appalling displacement policy for the Palestinians on the Gaza Strip, Dutton described the United States president as, quote, a big thinker, shrewd, a deal maker. The art of the deal, he said, was incredibly important to him. Then, as the election drew closer, Dutton set up policies and rhetoric around indoctrination in schools, cuts to the public service, attacks on diversity, and Doge-Style government efficiency unit. Even after Trump shocked the world with his brutal takedown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in late February, there were no adjustments. Trump, seemingly siding with Russia and blaming Ukraine for the war, did nothing to slow down Dutton's self-inspired momentum. It took the American president's outrageous tariffs in early April, setting off a trade war and threatening a global recession, to finally, 4 days later, cause the campaign to abandon some policies and try to build distance from Trump. And yet, when the lessons seemed to be learned, still this week, Dutton labelled Guardian Australia and ABC part of the hate media, another reflection of Trump and his dangerous attacks on a free press. So on and so forth. I'll leave it there. But essentially, trying to get into bed with Donald Trump as a campaign policy was deemed as being partly responsible for why the Liberal National Coalition ended up where it did. Of course, you can talk about the economy and the I think it was the central bank lowering interest rates just before the election was called was very, very clever and very useful for the Albanese campaign, because it was about the cost of living, but actually that eased. And then when you started seeing trade wars from the US, anything associated with the US became a bit of a, the US was a poison chalice, if you like. And so, it just gifted Albanese extra sort of ammunition and momentum. But actually, I think Dutton had been failing anyway on some of these policies that, you can say were associated with that Trump agenda. But I think the campaign, though, I was listening to a Liberal politician saying, look, we should have our policy points were made too late in the day. We should have been hit the ground running with the kind of manifesto policies much more clearly laid out earlier on in the game. But so on and so forth. I'm sure there'll be lots of dissections of this race. But as far as I'm concerned personally, for my own politics, I'm glad the Labour Party won. Much more aligned to how I think, but also better, I think, for the world, just more positively globalist rather than kind of Trumpian and isolationist. And with regard to Ukraine, I think it just naturally will be slightly better for Ukraine than the Liberal Party would have been. So, it's a pretty stomping victory for the Labour Party. As I say, the speeches were great. You had, Penny Wong was absolutely brilliant in introducing. She's really popular. Senator for South Australia. Is she foreign policy as well? Because I've quoted from her previously. And then Albanese came on, and he was absolutely fantastic. He gave I would say, just a barnstorming speech that was also really, really positive. So I guess we'll end it with the end of his acceptance speech, and that's his fiancée over there. I think they're going to get married soon, of maybe 6 years. That's his son. But a really good interview of Anthony Albanese on the rest of his politics with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. It was a very good interview, and I warmed to him very much in that interview. But here is the end of his speech.
My fellow Australians, Australians have chosen the Australian Labor Party as their government. And our government will choose the Australian way, because we are proud of who we are and all that we have built together in this country. We do not need to beg or borrow or copy from anywhere else. We do not seek our inspiration overseas.
That's your reference to Trump very directly. He did it earlier on in the speech, but that's it again.
We find it right here in our values and in our people. Tomorrow we dedicate ourselves to your service. We renew the great responsibility and the opportunity of government. And with pride and purpose, optimism and determination, with faith in the fair go and faith in each other. We return to the work of building Australia's future. Thank you all.
And yeah, that was just the very end, but it really was a very good speech. Let me know what you think about this. If you've got anything to add, I think the latest stats are pretty conclusive that they've done a pretty good job, the Australian Labor Party, of winning that election. So
Good night.
there you go. They've ended their live. ABC have ended their live analysis, so it's probably a good time for me to end. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.